everyone. We're going to be talking to Tim Madigan about his book, The Burning, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. My name is Bethany Grofterow. I'm the executive director of the Museum of Old Newbury, and it's my pleasure to be part of the volunteer team of the Newburyport Literary Festival. This is our 17th year bringing authors and readers together. It is now my honor to introduce Tim Madigan. Oh my goodness. Tim Madigan's books include the critically acclaimed and best-selling The Burning, which you're going to hear about today, which is the definitive account of America's worst episode of racial violence. The Burning became a New York Times bestseller in June 2021. There's a fun story behind that. He's also published a novel of The Greatest Generation, Every Common Sight, and another work of nonfiction of The First Class, A History of the Kimball Art Museum, a behind-the-scenes account of how the world-renowned Fort Worth Cultural Institution came to be. It was a 1995 assignment for the Star Telegram that led to Tim's interview with Fred Rogers, the icon of children's television, and a close friendship between the two men that lasted until Rogers' death in 2003. Tim's memoir, I'm Proud of You, My Friendship with Fred Rogers, is an intimate account of Rogers' human greatness and a testament to the healing power of friendship. That transformative relationship and Tim's own experience as a seeking and healing human being remain at the heart of his work. That's beautifully put. More than a decade after it was finished, I'm Proud of You continues to inspire readers around the globe. And Tim continues to speak of Mr. Rogers and matters of the heart to varied audiences around the nation. I see a return visit for you to the Literary Festival, Tim. But for today, let's go ahead and get started talking about The Burning. Over to you, Tim.
Well, geez, thanks so much. It's we've had so much fun just chatting among ourselves here that this is just kind of bonus material, having to do the program. I'm really glad to be here. This is a wonderful event, and I'm really honored to be part of it. And I'm really grateful any chance I get to talk about the Burning and talk about the Tulsa Massacre, because I think it's so important in so many different levels. It was first, it was first published in September 2001, and I'll tell you give you kind of the full background in a minute. But when it was published, and I'm very proud of the book, but when it was published, I mean, it got great reviews in all the right places, but no one read it. And it just felt, I think, at that point in our history, I just don't think a lot of people are interested in reading about something so horrible or what the real history of race in this country has been. Which I thought, well, okay, not much you can do about that. But then in the fall of 2019, I noticed that the sales of the book really started to skyrocket just kind of out of nowhere. And so I started poking around on the internet and found out that HBO's Watchmen series that some of you might have seen or are familiar with, the first 10 minutes of the series were a very realistic depiction of the race massacre, of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And that in the press that Damon Lindelof, the creator and the director, did around the series, they said that my book, The Burning, was their primary source material for those first 10 minutes. And so, wow, that was pretty cool. And then George Floyd was murdered, and we all know about the racial reckoning that happened. And with Tulsa being the worst incident of racial violence in our nation's history, there was a lot more interest in the book through that. Donald Trump made a trip to Tulsa around the time of Juneteenth, and then the 100th anniversary of Tulsa was coming up, which inspired interest in that event all over the world. And when I was in Tulsa for the 100th centennial commemoration, I had dinner with Damon Lindelof and one of the screenwriters. And I said, guys, for the first 20 years this book was published, I think I sold 2 copies. And the screenwriter said, well, you're just damn lucky that we bought one of them. And I'm damn lucky. It was really a cool thing. And I think more importantly, it took something like that, a mass or a cultural event like that, mass culture event like that, to really do what hadn't been done in a century, which was to really introduce Tulsa, what happened in Tulsa, to a large group of people. And Nicole Hassel, the director, told me that the night of the series began, or the pilot episode ran, which included the depiction of the massacre. She said what was trending on Twitter, as popular as Watchmen was, what was trending on Twitter wasn't Watchmen, it was Tulsa, the Tulsa Massacre. And she said she learned that 500,000 people had done internet searches, basically trying to find out whether or not what had been depicted on TV had actually happened. And lo and behold, of course, they find out that it indeed had happened. So that was really an important cultural moment in American history, I think. I was born and raised in a small town in northern Minnesota. There were not a lot of Black people in my hometown. In fact, there was one Black family that lived there in all my years of growing up. And I went to school at the University of North Dakota, eventually moved to Texas to work in newspapers. But throughout this, through my young adulthood, even though I consider myself to be a person of reasonable curiosity and goodwill, race just wasn't on my radar screen. Not only the racial issues that we faced through my young adulthood, but the race history just wasn't on my radar screen. It didn't feel relevant to me. And by the time that I got to the Fort Worth newspaper in 1984, there were people of color working with me, and okay, this is cool. But then in early winter of it was January of the year 2000. My boss, my editor at the paper in Fort Worth, came up to me and she handed me a wire story, AP wire story out of Tulsa, a printout. And I don't remember what the overall topic of the story was, but the background of it had to do with something called what was known at the time as the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. And in this story, it said that May 31st and June 1st of 1921, a very prosperous, one of the most prosperous African-American communities in America called Greenwood had been destroyed by a white mob in Tulsa, numbering up to 10,000 people. And 300 people were killed, most of them African-American. 10,000 people were left homeless, hundreds of businesses, homes, churches, schools were burned to the ground. I typically say that the photographs of Tulsa after that happened looked like Hiroshima or Nagasaki after the atom bomb. I mean, the place was completely leveled. And the stories, the stories of the atrocities that I would later come to learn are just mind-numbing. Anyway, so when she handed me this story, I looked at her and I said, this can't be true. Anything so horrible, we would certainly know about it. It would be kind of one of a very prominent aspect of American history. And she said, I had the same reaction. So she sent me to Tulsa. And fortunately at the time, this is 20 some years ago now, and a lot of people who survived the massacre were still alive. And even though there were people in their 70s and 80s, I had the chance to interview many of them and hear the stories. And even though it had been all this time, they could still smell the smoke and hear the gunshots and the screams. It was still very vivid for them. And there was still a palpable sense of fear that they felt, even though they finally felt comfortable talking about it publicly. I wrote a piece for my paper that ran under the headline, Tulsa's Terrible Secret. And that led to my opportunity to write a book about it. But one of my most vivid memories from this experience happened on my first trip to Tulsa when I was working on the newspaper piece. One of the most instrumental characters in kind of restoring Tulsa to history was a Oklahoma State representative named Don Ross, an African American who represented what the Greenwood district, what was the Greenwood and what is the Greenwood district today. And it's through his work that something called the the Tulsa Race Riot Commission was organized by the Oklahoma legislature, and a formal study of what happened was finally done. This was in the late 1990s. So anyway, on my first trip, I had a long interview with Don in his office, and then that night, we decided to have dinner together, and we went to a very lovely, quiet Chinese restaurant in Tulsa. And by then, I thought it was just going to be kind of a social thing. And as we were going over our menus, I was just trying to make conversation when I asked him this question. I said, "So Don, tell me what was it like for African Americans after the Civil War?" And I'll never forget that he's a very kind of a bombastic guy anyway, and he raised up his hand and smashed it down on the table loud enough that all the silverware jangled, and other people in the restaurant turned and looked at us. And he said, "And you're one of the educated whites." He said, "If we can't count on you to know our history, who can we count on?" And from that time on, his name for me was Ignorant White Boy. And that really had an impact on me. I was ashamed that I didn't know more about the history. And one of the great things about doing the book, as opposed to the newspaper story, the book allowed me to do a deeper dive into the history of race in America. And what was really important, once I learned it, it was totally eye-opening, because what I learned was that what happened in Tulsa in 1921 was not some sort of grotesque historical anomaly. If anything, it was perfectly consistent with what was going on in our nation at the time with regards to race and a lot of other ugly realities, not just against African Americans, but other kind of marginalized people. So it wasn't an anomaly, it was a metaphor. And the only thing unusual about it was its magnitude, perhaps. And what I learned about that time in our history was just shocking and horrifying to me, about the realities of Jim Crow and racial violence and then lynching. And city after city, there were these so-called race riots in which really white mobs found some sort of a pretense to attack, innocent Black people. One of the most striking things that I've learned, and this has always stayed with me, was in 1914, one of Hollywood's first blockbusters was a movie called Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, who is a revered pioneer and filmmaker. And really what this movie was nothing but a celebration of the reincarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, that invoked the most vile racial stereotypes you can imagine. And Woodrow Wilson endorsed it, gave it his highest endorsement, as did the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and the film played to packed houses across the country, not just in the South. And the most popular Halloween costume, or one of them, in those years, was the Klan robe, and it just went on and on. Like I said, it totally blew my mind. So all of a sudden, this ignorant white boy from a small town in northern Minnesota wasn't so ignorant anymore. And it changed me. The experience changed me, and it changed me for the better. from that time on, I could not look at a person who was different from me in the same way. There was a deeper sense of compassion and a deeper sense of curiosity about people who are different than me, wondering what their story had been, knowing that everyone had one. And it was my belief and my hope when the book was first published in 2001 that millions and millions of other white people of goodwill would have, once they learned the history, would have the same experience, a version of the same experience that I did, which was that once they learned the history, their hearts would be changed. And I'm very happy to report that, especially in the last few years, there have been a whole bunch of people reading the book. And I've talked to a bunch of groups, and I've talked to a bunch of book clubs of white people in the last few years who are basically saying, A, we didn't know about Tulsa, we didn't know about our race history, and how could they? Because it was never taught. But once once they learned it, things shifted. And so, and it's not just my book. There's a lot of other great material out there now, and where I think a lot of white America, and very, despite what some of the louder voices you hear trying to keep race from being taught, there's a lot of people in white America, people of goodwill, as I said, who are very intentionally are trying to understand and are trying to do what they can to participate and change for the better. And so that is all very encouraging to me. And again, that's why opportunities like the one today are so important to me, that I get to kind of continue to spread the message. I've always said that the target audience for my book was white people, even though Black people have been very kind to me too. The massacre itself, again, Tulsa is a metaphor. So everything that happened there to precipitate this conflagration, the massacre, it was fairly typical of other things that were happening in the nation at the time. Greenwood grew up starting shortly after the turn of the century in the 1900s, because oil was struck in Tulsa virtually overnight. It became this oil metropolis with skyscrapers and money all over the place, and many Black folks moved to Tulsa, moved to Greenwood to capitalize on the wealth, because these oil people needed gardeners and chauffeurs and carpenters and bricklayers and maids and did those kind of jobs, and they were paid very well for them. And then they take their money north across the railroad tracks back into Greenwood, where a very thriving professional class of people sprang up to basically serve them. Doctors and lawyers and newspaper people and restaurateurs and mechanics. And it was a really thriving, the music, the food. It was known as the Black Wall Street. One of the best places to be in the United States if you're an African American. And a lot of people who lived there thought that they felt like they had finally realized the promise of America for people of color. And it turned out that belief was naive, because when you are a successful Black person in that time, you walked around, you went through life with a target on your back, because successful Black people were automatically labeled uppity by whites. And there's a sense of jealousy, and the big thing was to keep Black people in their place, and people who aspired to or did achieve rising to unusual heights, was typically not greeted with a lot of enthusiasm by white people. So there's a lot of jealousy of Greenwood, and a really key element of what happened there was World War I, because for the first time in our history, Black soldiers fought and died for their country in large numbers. And there was an assumption among many of them as they went to fight that this would finally demonstrate their fealty and loyalty to the United States, and that finally the conditions in which African American people were living would finally improve, and they would be recognized as equals. What happened instead was, when they came back to the United States, was that if anything, the conditions had deteriorated, and there are way too many stories of African American soldiers being lynched in their uniforms. And yeah, and a side thing about lynching, that another thing that horrified me is that lynching was something of a spectator sport. In many communities across the South, particularly, it was reported in newspapers like box scores, and women would put on their finest clothes and pack picnic lunches and bring their children to watch these things happen. It was just, again, me to get my head around even now. But when they came back from the war and found out that things had gotten so much worse, they were not these veterans were not in any mood to allow racial violence to continue without severe pushback. And that's what happened in Tulsa around the time of the massacre, because a young African-American boy, again, typical of what went on in the country, was accused, probably erroneously, of assaulting, was assaulting a young white woman in an elevator. And he was arrested. His name is Dick Rowland. And cops investigated it, and pretty quickly came to the conclusion that there was nothing to the allegations. And I think that in the initial days, Dick Rowland was being held in custody more for his own protection than anything. And things would have probably died down were it not for the fact that at the time in Tulsa, there was a newspaper war between the two major white papers. And one of them tried to sell papers with just unabashed race baiting. And on the front page on May 31st of one of these papers, the editor had published an editorial under the headline, which has disappeared. You can't find one now, but everyone remember what it said: "To lynch Negro tonight." It hit the streets in mid-morning, and within a couple of hours, hundreds of people had gathered at Tulsa, or at the courthouse there, to either participate in the lynching or observe it, because I said it had become something of a spectator sport. The white sheriff in Tulsa said, "It's not going to happen. You're going to have to kill me to get this guy." And Willard McCullough is his name, and I think he's one of the heroes of the story. But of course, people across the tracks read this headline too, and the black veterans, and most of them black veterans, some of them leading entrepreneurs, armed themselves, went to the courthouse that night, and basically said, "We're not going to let this happen here." They meant to offer their services to the sheriff to protect this prisoner, and they actually made 2 trips to the courthouse that night. The sheriff told them that he had it in hand and to go back to Greenwood, because it was obviously a very volatile situation. On the second trip to the courthouse, these African Americans made this convoy, the short convoy from Greenwood to the courthouse. When they got there, there was an altercation between an African American and an old white guy. Somehow or another, a shot was fired, and that's when all hell broke loose. Both sides were heavily armed. There's a heated exchange of gunfire. Several people fell dead there at the courthouse. The black people retreated. The black fighters retreated across the tracks into Greenwood and prepared themselves for the onslaught that they knew was to come. And from the moment that first shot was fired, Dick Rowland, the young guy, became an afterthought, because these black people had committed the ultimate sin in the minds of so many whites, which was they stood up for themselves. And so from that, now about 10:30 that night, overnight, in some sort of coordinated way, and no one can really know exactly how it happened, other than it had to have been coordinated because of how efficient it was. About 10,000 people marshaled themselves at strategic points along Greenwood, and then at I think it was 5:06, and they armed themselves with guns and ammunition, kerosene and torches. And at I think it was 5:06 that morning, a whistle blew, whether it was a train whistle or a factory whistle, but it clearly was a signal for the assault to begin. And while the white mob was initially repelled by Black people who had armed themselves and were going to fight fiercely to defend their homes and businesses, that they were quickly overrun because of greater numbers and weaponry, which included machine guns perched at strategic points and just and airplanes firing down on the line of refugees that had formed trying to flee. I think it was the first time, maybe the first and only time that has ever happened in American history. But the Greenwood was quickly overrun, and like I said, the photographs of the aftermath are just devastating. There was nothing left except a few outhouses because it was said that the mob didn't want to waste kerosene on outhouses. Several of those people told me that I interviewed back in the year 2000. One of them was Eldoris McCondersey, who was in her late 80s at the time. And she was a girl of 8 or 9 or 10 years old when this happened. And so far as she knew, everything was fine. But then one morning her mother comes in and wakes her up and says, "Eldoris, get up, we have to run. The white folks are killing the colored people." And she goes, "Oh my God, what is this about?" So they grab her out of bed and take her. They fall in with this line of refugees fleeing from what was going on in Greenwood. And Eldora says they hadn't gone far when these planes appeared above them, and she thought initially it was fat raindrops that were hitting around their feet. And what she quickly realized was that what they actually were bullets coming down from people firing down at them from these planes. And that terrified her to the extent she broke away from her parents and ran into some sort of a shed, and a chicken coop, I think it was, and pulled open the door to try to hide. And the place was already packed with other adults. And her father finally pulled her out of the chicken coop and into this line of refugees. But she told me that day, there were other things about it. That day she told me she gets up in her living room and walks across the living room and picks up a couple of Kleenex, and she says, "I should know better than to talk about that day without holding a couple of these." There were many other stories like that I heard that were just very, very powerful. And one of the things that has always struck me was how I was treated with such grace and kindness by these people. And then nothing happened. The national media came in and wrote about it for a while, and then and then they disappeared, and Tulsa Blacks were afraid, and Tulsa whites were ashamed and afraid of being prosecuted. So if you had moved to Tulsa 5 years after this happened, you would have never known that it happened. One of the most remarkable conspiracies of silence in American history, and I think it truly is one of the most interesting stories in American history. But learning this changed my life, and I had an experience just a few weeks ago after reading about the atrocities that were perpetrated in, I believe it's pronounced Bucha, the suburb of Kiev, and just the horrible stories you heard. And as I was reading these stories, I had the thought that this is familiar to me. And where have I heard about this before? And then it dawned on me that where I'd heard it before was I'd written it before. You could have transposed what happened in Bucha onto Tulsa. I mean, it was the same level of evil and hatred and atrocity that happened on our soil in 1921. And I think that I'm not smart enough to know why that is, but I think that's really important for us to know. For many different reasons. I think it's important for us to know our true history, not the nostalgia that so many people seem to yearn for. And one of the dirty little secrets, I think, is that when you learn the history, when I learned the history, it didn't make me ashamed. I wasn't alive in 1921, but it made me sad. And it deepened me as a human being. And there was a reference made to my friendship with Fred Rogers, and one of Fred's favorite sayings is, "It's much easier to love someone when you know their story." And I think that's true, but we have to know the story. We have to know the real story. We have to know the real story of our neighbors. We have to know the real story of our nation. We have to know the real story of our world. Because we have to know what we're healing from. And it's not about blame. It's not about shame. It's about trying to deepen the bonds, and it's about finding common humanity in a real and authentic way. And I think that there's only one way to do that, and that is to really have the courage to face the truth, not only about ourselves, but about the world we live in. So I'll conclude my remarks there. It's 11:05, and if any of y'all have any questions, that'd be great. So fire away.
That was just wonderful. Thank you so much for that perspective. There's so much there to think about. We've got a couple questions in the Q&A that I can read for you. When you were first assigned the story, did your editor say why they wanted you to pursue this?
Well, she was just a really good journalist and a good person, and she knew that, and she was just astounded that anything like this could have been kept a secret. And I think we were both a little skeptical that anything could have actually been that horrible, and for us not to know about it. And to be crass, it was just a really good newspaper story. And at that time in the year 2000, there's a kind of newspaper story that people just didn't want to read. There was the way the culture was at the time, I think there was very little stomach for that sort of thing. Because I wrote that story, and there are many other national and international stories about Tulsa that came out in the late 1990s. And one of the reasons they did was because of the Murrah bombing in Oklahoma City in 1995, which was proclaimed to be the worst act of domestic terrorism in our nation at the time. And Don Ross, the person I referenced earlier, went to Bryant Gumbel, who was covering Oklahoma City, and said, as terrible as this is, the worst thing happened up the road in 1921. So Bryant Gumbel did a whole big piece on it on the Today Show about a year later, and then it became a national thing, and the Race Riot Commission was formed. And so there was some publicity. It wasn't a secret, but in 2019, 500,000 people were still going to the internet to see if the Tulsa Race Massacre actually happened. So, I mean, it was just at the start, it just was a really good, really good and important newspaper story, I think.
Wonderful. All right, we've got another question. Given that this history has been so little told, do you think the sunlight your book has shed on these events will be dimmed by the recent laws that seem to restrict teaching such stories? What have you and your book encountered so far, if anything?
Well, I don't know that, I haven't heard about my book being banned anywhere, that I know of anyway. I haven't encountered any kind of pushback about my book specifically. But I think I don't think that what's happening now can completely undo kind of our evolution as a people in terms of trying to face this stuff. What it can do is delay it. And I was, I had the kind of probably naive belief that after George Floyd and all the energy in the world after that we had finally turned a corner, and that everyone would kind of come see the light, and we had all worked together to try to make this a more just world. Obviously, that didn't happen, but a lot of noise has been generated over the pushback against that. But what you don't hear about are the millions of people out there whose hearts have been changed. And they just don't make headlines. They gather in book clubs and they have really difficult conversations about this. And they say, what can we do to make a difference? I'd much prefer that schools and everyone else would say, as difficult as this is, we need to teach it. And I think a lot of places are. Enough places aren't that the journey has been delayed some, but it's inevitable that we get to where we need to be. And I think that the greatest resource and the greatest source of hope I have in that regard is the young people. They see the world in a much different way than people my age do. And, whether it has to do with race or has to do with climate, and they are insisting on knowing the truth, and in numbers that are unprecedented in human history, I think, and that gives me a great deal of hope.
Wow, wonderful. All right, we have another question from Glee. What was the reception you received when trying to interview white people versus Black people, Black residents, about this event?
I couldn't interview. Well, the only white people I could interview were those who witnessed it and were horrified by it. One of the most remarkable things is, this, because I could talk for an hour on the conspiracy of silence alone, but initially after this happened, white Tulsa was celebrating it. They were making postcards and sending them all over the place, and all of a sudden, Tulsa leaders realized that they have a huge PR problem. So they basically shut everything down, and white people just wouldn't talk about it. It was impossible to find anyone to interview who participated. And there were anecdotal stuff about how 50 years later something about racial violence would come on the radio in Tulsa, and then grandpa would disappear into the wilderness for 3 days. But we did the math. Tulsa was a city of 75,000 people at the time this happened. You figure just, estimate that about 100 or about 50% of them are children. So that takes it down to 35 or 40,000 people. 10,000 of the Tulsa residents are African-American. So that drops it down to 30,000. And the mob was estimated to be up to 10,000. So that's one in three adults who participated in this. And if they didn't participate in it, they sure as hell knew someone who did. And it wasn't as if people in Tulsa at the time didn't know right from wrong. I mean, the sheriff is a perfect example of that. And there are other stories I've talked to of this one woman was in a nursing home when I talked to her back 20 years ago, remembers how her father, who was a very prominent construction company owner in Tulsa, she was 8 or 10 at the time, and her father was just horrified. He employed a bunch of Black people, and he took her around and drove her around searching for his workers, but he was just horrified by what he saw in the morning of, or the afternoon of June 1st, 1921, and up to and including taking an old Black woman who was holding a dead infant in her arms, driving them to the mortuary in White Tulsa. And this guy said to his daughter, "This is where hatred leads." So people knew that this was wrong. And to me, it was the 2 out of 3 who didn't stop it or just as complicit as the ones who participated. And so, but none of those people talked about it. I don't, then there occasionally some stash of photographs and stuff would surface, but it was really remarkable the extent to which that conspiracy of silence was successful, for a century after this happened.
Wow. It's powerful stuff. Okay, we've got time for, I think, another 2 questions. Let's see. I think you've sort of answered this one a little bit, but do you think the treatment and history of the Tulsa burning and massacre illustrates what is explored by critical race theory?
That's a very good question. And to the extent I understand what critical race theory is about, critical race theory to me is a very kind of scholarly exploration of systemic racism. And one of the deals that after you learn this history, you realize, of course, there's systemic racism. It cannot be otherwise after this history of ours. But that's to me, that's a separate issue. To me, the starting point of all this, and there's amazing scholarship going on in terms of the effects of systemic racism, and to me, in a lot of ways, it's as shocking as some of the things I learned about the 1920s. But to me, that you got to start with the story. You got to start with the story of our racial past. And Tulsa is effective because it is a very compelling story. And one of the things I tried to do in writing it was to create a narrative and to try to make it as cinematic as possible, because you can invest and try to create a narrative engine and create characters so that people would feel compelled to keep turning the pages through difficult material. But it's a story that changes people, and real change, in my humble opinion, will not happen until enough hearts have been changed that people are willing to become invested in the change. You don't do that by talking about such an unfortunate term, critical race theory, critical in theory, because people just want to hate academics anyway, a lot of them. But that's not where we should be.
Right.
The where we should be is with the story. And to me, critical race theory is a fig leaf for people who don't want to go there for whatever reason. And not only that, it's a see-through fig leaf. So I just think we need to keep coming back to the story. And critical race theory is, I applaud people who made this their life's work to understand the impact of Jim Crow and our race history today. But I'm invested in going back to the beginning and trying to tell the story of where it started, and inexorably it leads to today. But we need to start there, I think.
Excellent. Thank you for that thoughtful answer. We have time for one more question, and I think I would, I'm going to make a comment and then I'll ask my last question. My comment is that I wrote a book about a young man who died in World War I, who was from Newburyport. And I will say that, I take something away in my heart from every session that we do here at this festival, and the idea that young men would go through what those young men went through in World War I, the horror of that war, and then come home and not be able to trust that their country could protect their own safety, to me is so tragic and mind-blowing, because they'd already been through so much. That's my comment. That's sort of where that hit me in the heart. Really powerful for me. So thank you for that. Thank you for giving me one more aspect of that story to think about as well.
Well, but just meditate on this, the injustice of that, the pain of that, the rage in that, multiplied by tens and millions of people all over the world, and that wound was just suppressed, and that energy lives today. This is not Tulsa is not I'm going to contradict myself. Tulsa is not a history story. It's a story of today. About the kind of the psyche or spiritual energy that lives in white and black people as a result of what our history has been. And to get kind of metaphysical about it, I think the only way you can really dissipate that or heal that is by actually learning what it is you're healing from. And so it just, but it is such a wonderfully profound. I'm so grateful I've done this work, because it's such a wonderfully profound process to come to try to come to terms with this, and it is life-giving, and it doesn't deprive. That's what people need. God, it's hard work and it's painful, but we're all better people as a result of it. And to what you just said about your reaction to the story about the black fighters, I mean, multiply that times a million people.
Yep.
And what a different world this would be if people were just willing to have those feelings and look at those truths.
Absolutely. Well, I cannot possibly imagine a better way to end this session. I could feel like we could talk for another 2 hours and only just begin to scratch the surface. So we have I apologize to everyone whose questions we didn't get a chance to answer, but I hope you'll read the book. Tim, I have found you such a wonderful conversationalist and new friend, and I'm sure that you would be very happy to talk to your fans in another venue as well. So I'm sure we'll have you back. Thank you so much for taking your time.
Yes, I've really enjoyed it, and you're delightful, and I hope we talk again soon.
We will. Thank you so much, Tim.
Take care.
All right.